Gavin Bannerman. I'm the Director of Queensland Memory here at the State Library of Queensland. And I'd just like to welcome you all here today. I think it's a really great opportunity to learn a little bit more about our fellowship program for 2019. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we gather today. This is a traditional meeting, sharing and gathering place for local Aboriginal people, and it's a tradition that we will continue today and on for generations and generations of fellows as well. So I think it's a really important place, an important tradition that we continue on, and this year is the year of International Year of Indigenous Languages. So keep your eyes peeled for a lot of activities that we're undertaking in that space of Indigenous languages through Queensland. So this event is going to be recorded for those people who couldn't make it, or if the traffic was just too bad and too much of a disincentive. We've got a recording of this, so if you've got any concerns or anything, please let myself or Meg over here know. This is a question and information session, so there are no dumb questions. Like, fire away. This is your chance to ask all those questions you've been burning to ask. The motivation for our Queensland Memory Awards and for our program is based along that purpose of establishing State Library of Queensland as Queensland's leading reference and research library. So that's from the people who are fellows through to the people who come into the reading room every day to do their research. We are about research, supporting the research and discovery of Queensland stories. I'd also like to acknowledge the support of the Queensland Library Foundation, who, through their kind monetary support, support the amounts that go towards the fellowships, the monetary amounts. As a bit of an update for, hopefully everyone's seen the website or has seen some rough information about the suite of fellowships that are on offer for this year, but we do have 2 new fellowships. We have an honorary fellowship category, and we also have a placemaking fellowship, which is the first time we're offering that fellowship. I'll run through just a few quick dates, which will hopefully guide you in the preparation of your applications. The due date is 29th of March at 5 o'clock, and the information is on the website for the Queensland Memory Awards. So yeah, 29th of March, 5 p.m. is your due date. There's also presentations that will be scheduled for our current range of fellows for June, July, so after the due date. But if you are interested in what our fellows are doing and the research that they're undertaking, you can go there. I'd just also like to acknowledge, so current fellows, could you please put your hands up? So I'd just like to acknowledge Deborah Terranova, Hilary Davies, and Jennifer Moffat. Yeah. She's probably on the freeway. So yeah, I'd just like to welcome them and say thanks for attending today. We'll probably get through some of the more concrete details of the fellowships through today, but I just wanted to now introduce our panel of people who've been involved in one way or another in previous fellowship programs, whether that be as a judge, as an actual fellow themselves, or as in the collection space, supporting people on their research journey. So I'll probably just introduce Helen first. So Helen Gregory is an esteemed historian. She is super well credentialed, and it's privileged every time we have her in the building. She knows more about Queensland history than I think anyone could ever accrue in one lifetime, and she adds that perspective into research and that that historical context to the things that we do with our program. So welcome, Helen.
Thank you, Gavin.
Then next up we've got Greer Townshend, who was a ANZAC 100 fellow. So Greer is a visual artist, arts worker, and she has continued her body of research looking at interpretations of things such as World War I diaries, and has extended that practice to other works as well. So welcome, Greer. And then next we've got Toni, Risson, who was a Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame fellow. I I forget the years, I'm really sorry.
2016.
16. Looking at Greek cafes and the history of Greek cafes and the business model behind those early Greek immigrants into Queensland, and it's research that is continuing and getting a life of its own now because Toni's working as a curator with an upcoming Greek cafes exhibition at State Library for the later part of this year, so keep your eyes peeled for that. And then on the end we've got Robyn who's our lead of collection building at State Library Queensland. So building, what do we need to collect? What should a Queensland collection look like? What do we need in the collection? For all those hard and thorny issues that get thrown at Robyn. But it's the collections that we're able to build and able to preserve and able to look after, which enabled the research that people will do today and tomorrow. So just thank Robyn for all the hard work in making that happen. So we'll have a few different perspectives from the panellists, and we'll hopefully get a few opportunities to delve a little bit more into their experience. So what I might just start now is we'll do a little bit of I'll kick off some questions with the panel, and we've got mics here, so I'll just ask everyone, if you're talking, please talk into the microphone fairly closely. We'll do a bit of a Q&A with the panel, and then we'll have a roving mic to do a Q&A session with everyone, because I'm sure people will have specific questions, whether it's of myself or of what a specific panel member. Just like to acknowledge Jennifer. Thank you. Thanks for coming. We felt for you. We were looking at the expressway and it looked terrible. I might just start. It's such a habit to just like sequentially go like this, but I'll break the pattern a little bit. And because you're holding a microphone, you look ready to me. I might just ask, do you want to just talk a little bit about your process for formulating? And I assume everyone here today is either contemplating or thinking about, or it's in the back of their mind, you know, do I apply, or I have applied, or I want to apply, or I want to find out more, that coming from that place. So what was it like when you were starting to prepare and think about what you might do as a fellowship?
The reason that I applied was I've been working on a book about Greek cafes for probably almost 10 years, and I was not happy about the lack of knowledge there was about Queensland cafes, and appalled about how little we knew about Brisbane cafes. So I was really looking for a particular thing. I actually had applied for the John Oxley Fellowship in previous years and hadn't won that, and so I probably would not have come back and applied, but someone said to me, why don't you try the Business Leaders Hall of Fame Fellowship, since it's about shops, and anything with the word business in it just kind of turns me off. But businesses have a lot of cultural history and a lot of family stories with them, and so it was actually a really good fit. So I came specifically looking for that and found that the Business Leaders Fellowship really fitted for that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah. So would you say your motivation, one of your motivations was you saw a lack of information on the topic which you thought you could add to?
Oh, absolutely. There was almost nothing. I had a couple of cafe names and maybe a couple of family contacts in the Brisbane area, and that was all, like, almost a nothing.
Toni, Greer, did you want to talk a little bit about what, because when you're formulating your application, it's almost like you're starting a business when you're thinking, what is it that I can add? Like, what do I have that's distinctive? You know, how did you formulate those kind of questions?
Well, it's quite serendipitous actually the way I came to it. I had just finished about 6 months work on a solo show at Noosa Regional Gallery, which was to do with archetypal imagery and what's going on inside our hearts and what's important to us, what do we consider treasure, and symbols from our own lives and things. And part of that for me was becoming interested in the things that my grandmother still had from my grandfather being in the Second World War. Some really beautiful little items, and I was looking at the symbolic meaning of that and all that kind of thing. So right at the end of that, just before the show opened, I realised how interested I was in the war and those sorts of things, and then I just came across the fellowship by chance. and it just flowed on perfectly. Like that's exactly what I wanted to keep on doing. So it's luck, really.
And what was it like writing the fellowship application?
It was great because I love researching, so it was an opportunity to have a look at the sorts of things that are in the collection, and there's really great websites, the State Library website and the ANZAC 100 website, which lists all of the collections. And then also looking at Queensland Museum's collections as well, and then just spending a couple of weeks going through all of that and what sort of piqued my interest and how can I shape this into something that I'd like to explore. So, yeah.
So I might then, so you're a prospective, fellow, you're an applicant. What happened at the moment then when you found out that you were successful and you actually commenced your fellowship?
In what sense?
What were you feeling? What were your thoughts about, okay, how am I going to approach this?
Well, I was very excited when Chrissy called me, a little dance and a clap when I got the phone call. But it took me some time to figure out, I had thought about it. The application forces you to think about your methodology, you have to list it out, you have to think about the dates in your timeline and how that's going to fit. And in the application as well, you need to think about the outcome. So you kind of already have that structure there. But then getting here, it was really sort of learning how the library works, how the collections are ordered, and the ANZAC 100 website helped me a lot in terms of which soldiers do I look at first.
Because had you used primary source material much before?
Not really, no, I suppose not. But I had my show 2 years before that. I was interviewing people one-on-one, so it sort of felt similar, except this time I was doing it via letters and diaries. So I knew what information I wanted to pull out. But yeah, but obviously everyone, the staff at the State Library are really helpful. Anything you don't know, Robyn, I asked Robyn a lot of questions when I got stuck. So yeah.
And what about you, Toni? What was it like having the application on paper and then the reality of what you were faced when you are in the Neil Roberts Research Lounge, thinking about how am I going to approach this?
I think every fellowship's very different depending on what it is. I remember when the first day I came, we did this whirlwind tour of all the floors and all the offices and all the people, and I don't know whether the library expected us to remember all that, but it just kind of went over my head. But I felt like, I just wanted to say, okay, well, just show me where all your Greek cafe stuff is. And of course, you don't really know whether there is any, But other people had fellowships where they had 50 boxes of something. So how different an experience it would be to just have to come up every day and trawl through 50 boxes of stuff to someone like me who just has to go, okay, where would it be? If there was some skerrick of something about a cafe, where would it be? So I had 6 months of the fellowship working here doing that, and have sort of, they're still trying to get rid of me, haven't quite worked out how to do that. But yesterday, Chrissy, with whom I was working, thought to look in a box called Interiors, which I hadn't looked in before, but there were some beautiful photos of cafes in there. So, and then last week we found ads in theatre programs. So it's just, you have to think very laterally if you've got a topic that's not a 50-box collection. So I think it's such a different experience depending on what it is. But I really loved it that the library, when I was filling out the application, I thought, they're never going to give me this because I don't know what's in the library, so I can't even really tell them what I'm going to be looking at. But I think it's great that they could somehow see, well, we don't know what's in our library either, but we think this person might, be able to find stuff. So very good approach that they take to choosing fellows.
That might lead on to Helen. I was just interested in your thoughts about that process of identifying bodies of material which you may want to research, because I know that's something you're quite passionate about, of fellows being able to demonstrate that they have done a prior search of the collection and have some sort of understanding of what potential might be there.
Yes, that is extremely important, And just getting back to the two contrasting experiences, Toni's with practically nothing immediately jumping out of the collection, and the person with the 50 boxes. Now you might think, oh well, that's not a very suitable topic for a fellowship application, but there could be one aspect of something that's in those 50 boxes. Just say, for instance, you were looking at the sugar industry in Queensland. Now clearly no one can write a history of the sugar industry in Queensland in 1 year on a fellowship stipend. Impossible. Don't mention it, because the most important thing is to demonstrate that your project is achievable. But you might want to look at the experiences of people who lived in plantation houses in the old plantation economy in the Queensland sugar industry. So you probably would have 150 boxes, and you might have to search very hard to find the material that would indicate what the plantation life was like, rather than what the crop was like and where the markets were and who was breeding which variety and so forth and so on. And the idea of bringing things to light in the collection that are not obvious is extremely important, because the collection is vast. I mean, the images collection alone is enormous. And so if you've hit on an idea that might bring to light things that are, as Toni said, a box called interiors, or looking through advertisements. I've spoke to someone who was looking at advertisements in the old Queensland Journal called The Steering Wheel, which was enchanting about where you might drive in your car in the 1920s. It was even more interesting about why on earth they would advertise Arnott's Milk Arrowroot biscuits in the steering wheel. So there are lots of things that an inventive approach can bring to light, but again you come back to the thing that you must demonstrate in your application that your project is not only worthwhile, that it adds to our knowledge of Queensland's history, that it could add to our understanding of the collection here, but also add to the collection itself. But it's also very important just to make sure that you've done all you can to find out what actually is here before you actually submit your application.
And so, how would you feel about somebody saying, oh, I found this on Trove?
Oh, I'd say, terrific. Okay, you found an incident about a motor car accident at Woolloongabba in 1931 in which a policeman was killed. You want to look into that. Where do you look? Is there a purpose in understanding the causes of motor car accidents at Woolloongabba in 1931? There could be. There very well could be. So therefore, what you would then do is demonstrate why your idea could add to our knowledge and understanding of something important in Queensland history, and roads and cars clearly are, even though those of us who are traumatised by tonight's traffic probably would be thoroughly put off by the thought. But something on Trove can give you an insight into something that you might not have thought of. Now, I was preparing something the other day on about March 1919. One of the things that I thought was fascinating, and it is my ignorance that I'm happily here to admit, that the fate of the island of Nauru was an active matter for discussion in Queensland newspapers in 1919, as was the British Parliament discussing whether or not they should build a tunnel under the English Channel. So don't knock Trove, Gavin. It's very important, and you can get some good ideas.
Robyn, did you want to, in terms of collections and that sort of that raw material which might support a research project, did you just want to, can you summarise our collections in a few pithy sentences?
No. I could say something which would be a bit facetious, but as Helen said, our collections are indeed vast, and as staff members here at State Library, we're discovering them every day. So I guess in a few sentences, our collection is supposed to be a reflection of Queensland life. It's the documentary record of Queensland's history, I guess, in all its different shades and different forms and different time periods. So some of it is very accessible and well described, and a great deal of it is not. As a librarian, I think all people who become librarians are born with the word access kind of invisibly on their forehead. So that's what we're all about here, and so our mission is to describe our collections in a way which makes them as accessible to everybody as possible, and that's where you guys come in to help us do that.
Did you want to just give the kinds of things that you might find in our collection?
Sure. So we have business the records of organisations. So they're sort of business records. They're corporate history sort of records. We have personal records. So people's collectibles and the sort of the documentary elements of people's personal lives, families. We have station records, for instance, which document sort of the history and people of particular properties. Lots and lots of published materials, so serials, newspapers, magazines of every variety, local history, published and unpublished material. What else do we have? A great deal of audio-visual material. So one of the things we do is commission content as well as purchase it or receive it on donation. So again, in whatever we commission, it's usually a digital story or oral history or digital photographs. We're trying to make a record of Queensland life, so covering every kind of Queensland communities that are very recent to Queensland, communities that have been here for many decades indeed. And we try to absolutely, as is our mission, to represent the state in full, not just Brisbane. There's always a slight danger that because we are in Brisbane, our collection is very Brisbane oriented, but we try to make sure we have statewide coverage. So
I think Helen's got a thought that she wants to.
Yes, just picking up on what Robyn said, that I think one of the most important things that a project might be able to contribute to the library is something that can be digitised, because thinking of people who might be in Cloncurry or Thursday Island who can't pop into the library every time they want to know something, it might be possible that through your research, one of its outcomes, not necessarily the sole purpose of the research, but one of the outcomes might be to find materials, whether they're photographs or diaries, things that could be digitised so they're easily available to people in Cloncurry or Thursday Island.
absolutely.
It's one of the things that we've adjusted a little bit this year, where previously, we have a section where use of the collection is something that's really prioritised, but we're aware that it's not that our collections are perfect in every area, and there's some elements of Queensland society that aren't really well documented in the collection. So, for example, and it's predominantly collections such as ours have often been represent people who are wealthy and think about themselves as being important enough to be recorded in the John Oxley Library and the collections of the John Oxley. So, there might be elements of society, migrant history, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander history, women's voices, which aren't either immediately apparent or maybe underrepresented in the collection. So we've had to have a bit of a think about that use of collection, and it can also be a plus point where a fellow comes to us and says, look, and I think Toni's used this description in the past, you could have put all the material to do with Greek cafes and her topic in a wheelbarrow, don't want to do is disadvantage someone who only has a wheelbarrow full of material and someone who has a semi-trailer load of material, because in some ways, sometimes that paucity of material that we have in the collection can be something that can be addressed through that person's fellowship. So we've acquired material in our collection as a result of Toni's work with the Greek community in Queensland. So it's kind of one of those things that can be can have two sides to it. Like a lack of material can also, I mean, there needs to be some relevance to Queensland. We can't be like, we don't have enough, like works of Leonardo da Vinci in our collection or anything. So it's got to be relevant, but I think that's something that we've adjusted so that it can be widen the scope for inquiry. Sorry, I'm answering my own questions. So I might just get Toni just to talk a little bit about the project and how you undertook it, but then also how you brought community along with it, because I think some people, all fellowships are different. Some people it is really their research project, but for other people they're doing it on behalf and with other groups of people or with communities. So do you just want to talk a little bit about that process?
I think the first day I came here, one of the outgoing fellows said to me, talk to everybody about your project. So in the tea room, in the toilets, in the elevator, everywhere, just keep telling everybody about your project. And that was actually really good advice, because just being here, even though the stuff I was after wasn't necessarily here, just being here just sort of made things happen. I would use the word serendipity or magic as well. So one of the librarians here, I just had a brief conversation with him, and he gave me the contact details of some Greek people outside of the library, have nothing to do with the library, they're not represented in the collection. But that resulted in a really good history and some documentation of their stuff about a really important shop in the city. So that kind of thing happened a lot, where I was going out and meeting people, and even now, tomorrow I'm going to meet another family I haven't met too, that connects to a shop that's right in the centre of town. So I think that going out and coming back, a bit like a bee, bringing pollen back to the hive, it was a bit like that. And halfway through my fellowship, we decided that a blog would be a good idea, because we needed to get people's memories about these shops, and not necessarily just Greek people, but people who worked there for Greek people or people who were customers, to get them to add their memories to the little bits of skerricks of information that I could find. And so people through that have been approaching me saying, have you met this person, Last month someone came in with a sweets bag from one of the shops just across the river, just because they saw that. So I think depending on what problems you've got specifically with your fellowship, you can think up ways to address those issues. And so it was very much working with the Greek community, but it can be people in the library still that actually give you that contact. So definitely, if you win, definitely tell people in the lifts and the tea rooms and the toilets about what you're doing, even though you're sick of saying it because you've said it 4 times. They haven't heard it 4 times that morning.
Greer, I was wondering, in terms of, post fellowship, like your experiences of, does the fellowship end, like does the research end there? What kind of happens once that concludes that period?
Well, it hasn't finished for me. I think it's a huge project, and I sort of spent a lot of time. It finished in June last year, I think, July. So I sort of spent that year researching on and off, and then I continued once I officially finished here. But it's taken me some time throughout that year to figure out exactly what kind of work I wanted to make, and then to find the right place to have the show, which is now in the process of being finalised, which is exciting. So yeah, my show will open in November, so I'll be working on it, and obviously I want to keep looking at the collections right up until then, so that I stay in it. post the exhibition, there's so much work around it that I'd like to keep doing because it's really interesting collections. It's been amazing.
It might be worth, and it's worthwhile pointing out that we are quite supportive of people doing their research projects from multiple different points. So, you know, you can be an author, historian, a visual artist. Did you want to talk, because I found it quite interesting the way some people look at collections as research material. Some people look at it from a very aesthetic kind of point of view, and you were looking at some things of like the style of people's handwriting, whereas somebody might be reading that handwriting for the content that it provides.
Yeah, well, I was looking at the collections in a lot of different ways. So, but you know, obviously what they were saying, and in part two, because what I was trying to do was to basically distill imagery from the diaries and letters to just simplify everything to try and understand what the soldiers were saying on sort of a primal level, and just looking for the very simple imagery that they referenced throughout. So, for example, one of the soldiers, Herbert Melian, it's a collection of 2 years, and his diaries span 2 years, and he references forests quite a lot throughout those 2 years. And so I was sort of looking for imagery, really. And then, as you said, not only that, I was looking at what the diaries look like, the beautiful fragility of the paper, and it made me think of different artists that I've studied before who, how to incorporate text into your work, or even things like, there's a really beautiful collection of embroidered postcards, silk embroidered postcards, which I fell in love with very quickly. And because of that, I contacted the Queensland Embroiderers Guild and did a course learning how to do silk lace embroidery to try and incorporate that into the work somehow as well. So there are a lot of different aspects of the work that are really interesting and inspirational, and it enabled me to branch my work out in different ways that I wasn't anticipating, which was really exciting. So yeah, there's a lot of fruit there.
Helen, what do you look for in an application when you're assessing? I think this is probably a question most people will want me to ask.
I think probably as assessors we take very seriously a statement that's on the front page of the application form, and the first thing you must do is read the application form and make sure you understand the questions it's asking. Please answer the questions on the form, not one of your own devising, because that rather throws us off. But, for instance, it's looking to support a research project that uses the rich resources of the library and contributes to the creation of new knowledge of Queensland. The purpose of the fellowship is to research, explore and provide new understandings and knowledge about Queensland's history, providing outcomes both tangible and intangible. Now, that's the statement I keep in my mind when I'm reading applications. But I'm also conscious that the fellowship only runs for 12 months. So the next thing is, has the applicant explained how this project can be done in 12 months, as well as explain how it is going to use the resources of the library and contribute to our understanding of Queensland's history. So those are the things that are most important in assessing an application. And the outcomes also are important, tangible and intangible, and we've mentioned some tonight. Greer's exhibition, Toni's exhibition, Toni's books, but of course the possibility of digitisation of new resources, but we do live in the world of the internet, so what can be communicated to people out there? Because history doesn't belong to the libraries or the universities or the historians. The history is everybody's, and so it's how you can share and make as something else on the form says, make your work visible and accessible is extremely important. And so to think you might get an enormous book published possibly isn't very realistic, but you might find a wonderful publisher. So don't forget to put that in if that's really what you want to do. But must make sure you also include outcomes that make the work visible and accessible.
And that word access again. Robyn, did you want to just talk a little bit about the process of the staff support and like things that I know I've learned a lot of things from our fellows, but just how it's also an opportunity for staff to learn things from people who come through the program?
Oh, absolutely. It becomes a very mutually productive relationship. So when fellows come in there, we accommodate fellows in a particular lounge. So there's space and facilities for them, a printer and access online to everything they need. And really the staff are just on hand to answer questions, to help explain all the mechanics of retrieving material and then helping to make sense of that material if required. So and just to talk through ideas, as you were saying before, it's those conversations, those incidental sort of conversations which just spark your mind to think, oh, yes, we acquired something like that last year, and oh, if you go and have a look in this magazine issue from this decade or something, librarians generally have heads full of that sort of useless but actually useful knowledge. And so if we all just keep talking, ideas will come and good stuff will come. I was going to say, I wanted to say how helpful fellows are for us to, and as we were saying before, and it's that access thing. Sometimes collections are really well described. So a collection is only as accessible as the words we've used to describe it. Some things are only quite briefly described, and so the research you do and the things you find can be tremendously helpful for us to improve our description of things, so that we use more words or better words or just different words to then make the material more findable, more discoverable for everybody. So that's really important, and because the work fellows do makes those connections across disparate things in the collection, we can then use words and better description to join those all up, so we reflect online what you've done in practice.
One thing I did want to add is to remember the panel who looks at applications is like good examiners. We're not at all interested in what you don't know and can't do. We are interested in what you do know and can do. So just remember, you are not facing fierce invigilators, but we can only assess what you actually put there. So just be very careful that you are succinct and that you explain your purpose, how you're going to do it, and what the outcome is as clearly as possible. And something that really sparks our interest, and you think, wow, I never would have thought of researching that. So sometimes those projects are very inspiring to us too.
Great tips. We might get some questions from the crowd. I think we've got a microphone, so we might just make sure that you ask your question directly in the microphone, and we'll do our best to answer it.
Sorry to jump in so quickly, but as an artist, how has your practice changed or benefited from the fellowship? Has it changed, or how do you use the fellowship in your practice generally? And a question for everyone else is, if you haven't come from an academic background, do you think you're going to be able to do the research adequately?
Well, I love to research anyway, but I haven't really done it in a formal sense. I think it's, as I was saying before, when you have access to a lot of really interesting information and you're already interested in it, you just go deeper and deeper into it, then I've ended up exploring things that I wouldn't have naturally gone down that lane before as an artist. So with the lace embroidery, which I've never done embroidery in my life, but it was really exciting and such a beautiful thing to learn, and it's also so nice to go really deep into a project, and I've ended up creating multi-layered drawings is what my show is going to be, with lighting. They're going to be backlit, so it's quite complicated, but I think the reason that I arrived at that was because of the complex and very beautiful stories that I was reading about. It also inspired me to reach out to Queensland Ballet on top of Queensland Embroiderers Guild, and I asked the ballet dancers to model for me as part of the work, because something I noticed in the diaries was that everything was written with such grace and strength, and that combination really struck me, and so I wanted to find a way that, and I thought ballet dancers really demonstrated those two things. So none of those things I had been thinking about previous to the research, and it's been amazing. But yeah, I think there is sort of, I'm not an academic, I'm not a doctor, or I don't have a PhD or anything like that, but everyone was very supportive of me doing the fellowship, so yeah, I think there's a lot of support there if you need it.
I think having that curiosity and initiative is, I mean, we can run sessions of how to, search the catalogue and how to do some of those research skills, like that you kind of pick that up, but I think that initiative to contact Queensland Ballet, that curiosity, like they're the kind of attributes which I think are really unique and do sometimes make applications stand out.
As someone who's had a half-finished PhD in the bottom drawer for 40 years, I feel quite competent to respond to that question. But what Gavin said is absolutely correct. And while it is important that you do have good research technique, that you acknowledge your sources, that if you're going to use a photograph someone's given you, that you check on copyright provisions, if you're using oral history information, that the person who's told you the story has given you permission to use it. Those things are all very important, but they are things that people can help you with. So don't let the fact that you haven't got an academic background as long as your arm put you off putting in an application, because some of the things that might make you a bit wary are things that people can help you achieve. And quite often, people who come to things from entirely different backgrounds can lend, what Robyn was talking about, this whole new perspective. And we can all do with freshening up, believe me. So don't let that put you off. But again, if you don't have that kind of background where you've done lots of books with endless numbers of endnotes and whatnot, say that in the application and say how you're going to make your project achievable by overcoming that perhaps slight gap in your record. And so therefore that's again all about making sure you've explained how your project is achievable.
Question? I was wondering if you could talk to, you've got a new category about buildings or places. I was wondering if you could talk to that.
Sure. I'll run through the category just so just to give everyone the same information. So the categories this year, we've got the John Oxley Library Fellowship, which is our flagship sort of fellowship, Queensland history. The Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame Fellowship, which is looking at Queensland's business history. The Middlehouses Scholar in Residence. An honorary category, which we didn't have previously, but there's no stipend attached to that, but we do have an honorary category. And then the Placemaking Fellowship, which you mentioned. So the Placemaking Fellowship, it's inaugural year, and it's designed to specifically look at the place around West End where the Peters factory was located, and now then for West Village. So it's come through a desire to look at the stories behind that place and an awareness that some stories have been captured to date, but there's more work to do there. So it's kind of similar to some of the fellows' inkling to and starting point for applying is that there's a little bit more to this site than is currently on record. Like it's had, for example, some history is written about it, but it doesn't seem. It seems to be needed to be fleshed out more.
So it's that side in particular.
Yeah, for this year, yeah, it's particularly that side. Yeah, it's not choose your location and then tell us about that place.
Okay.
Yeah, specific to them.
Hi, I'm just wondering, can two people apply for one fellowship and share it if they're working on the same project?
Yeah, we've had examples of that. So one that springs to mind is Madeline King and Nadi Buick.
I remember your last name.
You know the right one. The Fashion Archives. They were two researchers who were the first Queensland Business Leaders Hall of Fame fellows, and they did it together. And you might have seen the book, The Fashion Archives. It's really great. It's a copy in the bookshop if you would like. And so I should also say, for previous fellows, we do a video, like a digital story with those fellows, and they're available on the website as well. But yes, they did it together, and we have had examples where there was an application for two people related to Australian South Sea Islander history who did it together as well. So we do take joint applications, and Chrissy's nodding to say yes. So that means no teams. So two is not a team. Three is a team. Three's a team. Okay.
Hello, I'd like to ask, is it possible to use any visual material in your application rather than just the 200 words in this section and the 300 words in there? Like to highlight what you've done previously or to add examples of things?
My understanding is that I suppose what we're trying to find a balance between, if you open the floodgates and then like you get a deluge of imagery, but I think there is provision for some indication of previous work.
Would you put that as an appendix or within the different questions?
That's a good question.
Sorry, you
Yeah,
can go
yeah.
back. Yeah.
I should explain myself. So we've done the form for application in the web
Yes,
online form.
Yes.
It's been done in our previous website. We've just done a website redevelopment, and I haven't actually looked at the new form in the new website redevelopment. But I think it is possible to have to give an indication of some of those things, but the actual upload, it's not like you can upload, a whole bunch of images and that sort of thing. So it is primarily text with that application. It's not like attaching a portfolio.
No, I get it.
Yeah.
Sure. Thank you.
Thanks. I just wondered whether you'd explain a little about the difference between the John Oxley Library Fellowships and the honorary category.
It essentially comes down to money is probably the main thing. There's a $20,000 stipend that is attached to the John Oxley Library Fellowship, thanks to the Queensland Library Foundation. And the honorary fellowship, which we've introduced, is a category where we were, no one's going to turn down $20,000 to do their research, but we were aware of a category of people who, for them the money was nice, but they wanted to do the access to the staff, the access to the collections, being in that place and doing that work was equally a motivating thing for them. And we could only ever give out one John Oxley Fellowship per year, and we were seeing people who were like, I really want to do this project, and we were seeing that as a potential blockage for research. So we've indicated if people would be open to that possibility, for them to indicate their willingness to undertake it as an honorary fellowship if they were unsuccessful in the John Oxley Fellowship. So some people might say no, like if I don't, I'm going for gold or nothing. But other people will be like, actually, I do want to do this, and I would be prepared to do it under that. So you get the same access to materials and resources and support that you would, and you get inducted. We do an induction, and you get, your own white pass, and all those sorts of things. And it is the first year of us doing it, so it would be, you'd be part of that first cohort. But we're thinking it's something that we can do to expand the range and nature of some of the research being conducted. But it's Queensland. It's related to Queensland history. It's not like, there's still a rigour to the application. So you would need to be like meritorious in that application. It's because there's a finite number of fellows that we can support.
And what's that number?
We don't know yet, but so just in terms of orientation, so people hopefully have been into, this is the John Oxley Library, so on this floor, this is where, Robyn, Toni, I, Chrissy, we work back of house behind the glass doors there, and the actual room where most of that research occurs as a fellow is in the Neil Roberts Research Lounge, which is just behind those glass doors there. So there's kind of a lounge area with desk and chairs and printer and that sort of thing. There's actually physical space, limits to the number of people we can stuff in there. People have different work schedules. So some people, they've got a 9 to 5, weekday job, so they come on the weekend, and that's possible. So it's not. Last year we had a large volume of, I think it was up to 10 or 11 actual fellows, and very seldom do we have all 10 or 11 on site at the same time, which could be a bit of a squish. And also, we probably couldn't give that quality of support to people. Like, it is something. It's a relationship which does need to be nurtured. And if we had like 50 people, we probably couldn't give the level of attention and support to those people. So we haven't put a fixed number on that, but we are mindful of our ability to give a quality, fellowship experience.
Hi there. I'm a skateboarder, and we only learn from the mistakes that we make. So that's the first important thing. Secondly, I do have a PhD, and we only get that from asking really silly questions all the time. So my question might seem a little weird, but can the panel talk about what is a really bad thing to do on the application form, and what not to do? Thank you.
Robyn, you're nodding. I should also context, Robyn was on the panel, I hope you don't mind me saying this, for, the ANZAC Centenary grants. So it's like, Robyn's read a lot of grant applications in the last 4 years.
Indeed. I think one thing, I guess, which irritates me in some applications is when people gloss over the background research that they've done. They sort of fudge it. You will need to demonstrate that you've had a proper look, and you need to express that in a way which really lets us know that you have. If an application says, looked at this database, looked at Trove newspapers, I can do that in 10 minutes here at my desk. That's no indication of anything. So I think if you're answering the question where it asks you to demonstrate what sources you've consulted, be specific and actually express that well. That would be a good one for me.
And if you're doing a project that it has the 50 boxes that someone talked about before, it's also important to demonstrate that you have found somewhere in those 50 boxes important information or important research material for the thing that you want to investigate. Don't describe what's in the 50 boxes, because as Robyn said, we know that. So just be very careful when you're saying what you have investigated, that you make clear what you've found or that is relevant to what you want to do. So that's also very important, because just saying you've looked at all the records of the Queensland sugar industry, well, to start with, I wouldn't believe you, but that doesn't demonstrate how it's going to help you with your project on plantation life in the 1870s, say. So just as well as saying what you have looked at, don't forget to say what in that is going to contribute to your research.
I think a bit of a red flag to me is when people sometimes put in things which they think you want to hear, and it's like, you know, sometimes people just put in, they've just done like buzzwords of like, I will create an online database of, and you're like, really? Like, are you really going to do that? And I sometimes, you know, people think, oh, it's got to be digital. So they'll say, I want to create this online experience and doing this. And it's like, I would prefer it to have a higher level of viability. Like if somebody is a coder, like great. And if they've got a track record of doing those projects, but you're not going to be able to like go over the learning curve of how to create one of those things in 12 months while doing your research. So I think it's a bit truthful to what your actual skills and what you bring is. And it's like, and if you're engaged and if you're bringing an audience on Instagram, you know, that through your visual art practice, and you're like, I've got 10,000 followers, like that would be awesome. Like that's a real plus. But if you're like, if, you know, we do a Google search on you and you've like, you know, you don't do any of that, and you're like, oh, I'm gonna like start doing social media. It's like you're starting from a really low base. So I think it's when people start using buzzwords where you like, they actually don't have the skills to back up what they're trying to say in the application. So my tip is just to be kind of true to who you are and your skills. And I'd also just say, I think skateboarding, like history, and if anyone saw the Stoke exhibition at the Museum of Brisbane, it was like, I think one of the best social history exhibitions in Brisbane in the last 10 years.
Really shouldn't say this, but check your spelling. Just get someone else to read your application, someone who has a good editor's eye. There's nothing more off-putting than poor syntax and bad spelling.
And don't get too carried away with the flowery prose when you're trying to convince us how worthwhile your project is. And please make sure your sentences, when you're explaining why your project is achievable, doable, important, that your sentences are fairly short, because those long rambling sentences, you get to the end of them and you think, what's this person trying to say? So those sorts of things, having an editor's eye, is very important. And in fact, one thing that can be very useful is to do a draft application and then pretend you're the assessor and see whether you're convincing yourself about this project. Because to try to be objective about your own work is a very important research skill in any case, but it's also very important when you're doing an application like this, because sometimes you think you've said something because it's in your head, but it's not actually there on the paper. And that's the thing. We can only look at what you've put on the paper, not what we think you probably meant to put on the paper, only what's actually there. So that idea of giving yourself time to revise and reconstruct if necessary is really important, because we do have an awful lot of paper to plough through. Do think of it in that sense too.
I mentioned an honorarium, I think, or stipend, and I think that's to be dispersed over a number of intervals. Can you say what you're actually expecting us to do with the stipend? Is that like a living allowance, or is it to be by research, by resources?
So in the fellowships, there's like you don't, with the monetary ones, you don't get the full amount straight up. There's milestones. So I forget the exact breakdown, but
Two payments.
there's two payments. It's basic. There's things which in different categories of the different fellowships. You know, you have to provide a progress report, participate in public programs, give a status update. So then that money is basically you invoice us and you get that on the milestone payment. The money is basically for you as you see fit. Some people who are, say, in an academic environment have used that money to buy back their time in terms of teaching money, like to offset the money that they would have got for being a tutor or teaching. Some people they use it as living expenses, but it's really up for that person to use the money to do what they need to do. So we don't dictate how it's spent or anything like that. I might just run through some of the guidelines. This information's on the website, but I'll just run through some quick guidelines. There's one question that comes up quite a lot is, can I do it out of hours? And yes, you can. Your swipe card access can be outside business hours, and you can undertake fellowship research on the weekend. There's a degree of flexibility, and some fellows and some will push the limits, and some have had to be like security to be like, okay, it's time to go home now. Like you've had enough today. But you're able to still do some research outside that business hours. I just want to emphasise that we encourage writers, researchers, historians. If you're doing research in order to write a book, that's totally that's absolutely within the realms of the fellowship categories. I just probably like to, because it's something that we're just trying to tighten up a little bit. If you're a state government employee, you just need to provide a little bit of information in terms of support from your employer. We just need to know that up front. That if you're applying and you are a state government employee, because there's just a few processes that we need to do at that end if you are successful. You can apply online or via post. There's those two methods with the application process. Are there any other questions?
Just one thing on this final checking that's really important. You might have a referee who's really familiar with your work, knows you well, and you put the name down. Please don't forget to ask the referee if they're willing for you to do this, because it'll be very embarrassing ringing a referee who says, who? Oh, what for? What? Oh, what are they going to do? Oh yes, no, they'd be good at that. They do that very well. Not going to cut it.
So yeah, if you're putting Helen down as a referee in particular. Was there anything, Hillary, Toni or Greer, anything, Robyn, anything you want to add that popped up?
I think I'd just like to say that I've really appreciated the flexibility that the library shows, that, the kinds of things that Helen's saying is they identify a project that's worthwhile and they identify someone that they think can do something worthwhile, but it's quite different from academic work then, in the respect that you don't get examined on it, or you don't have to turn in something and get it marked. It's really about you. It's about the work that you're doing. So as an academic, it took me quite a while to get my head around that really what the library wants is for you to come in and play with their stuff. They want to get people in here to find what they've got and do things with it. So if in that process it evolves, they're very happy for that. So I ended up, that the blog that I started actually became the major thing, and I ended up with, instead of 6 chapters about 6 shops, I ended up with about 30 stories about lots of shops.
Just very quickly, what's your blog?
GreekCafesInBrisbane.com. And that blog then got archived onto the library catalogue, so it's actually a digital resource, and actually more than anybody knows about Brisbane cafes. Like, it's an amazing thing, the amount that came out of that. So that was a really good outcome, but it's not the outcome that I set out to achieve. So I think that's a great thing about the fellowship and the library and the way that they approach us.
Greer, any
Um,
last nuggets?
Just some last little words. Just things like the space that you get to work in is so peaceful and so lovely, and I think that in itself helped me produce a lot of good work, having that space, somewhere quiet to go, and all those resources and things like that. And as Toni said, yeah, I think it's important to be really self-motivated and disciplined with what you're doing to make the most out of your year, because it has been an incredible opportunity for me and I've loved it. And the other thing that I would say about your application is to maybe think about your point of difference, and as Gavin said, to be true to yourself. And also, I always think it's handy to act as if you've already got the fellowship, like plan it out as if this is exactly what you're going to do regardless. And maybe if you don't get it, you can still do the research, you can still do the project.
I just wondered if you would go through the assessment process or the selection process.
The applications come in, we collate them, and the selection, we're in the process now of confirming the membership of the selection panel, so that hasn't been signed off yet. But basically, they all get collated. There's an electronic file, and some people like to work in print, and some people, you can scan the electronic files and look across multiple. So basically, they're reviewed by the panel, and then the panel will come along a scoring method, it's like a job application where there are selection criteria, and so we'll look at things within that matrix of the selection criteria. It's like, how does this perform against this criterion, this criterion, this criterion? And so generally what will happen is judges will score and then make notes of the applications, and often it depends on the volume. I forget the exact numbers, but there's been some years with John Oxley Library where we've had 80 applicants. So then you obviously have to shortlist that, and then you come to a process where, what are the strongest candidates, and then it happens, it depends on the nature of the projects, but often it's, you review the strongest ones, and then there might be a clear winner, you might whittle it down. Sometimes you can walk in and go, this is my favourite project, and to be totally convinced the other way at the end of the session. So basically it's reviewed, and then the panel get in a room with all of the applications, and they're assessed and reviewed and scored according to the criteria.
And that criteria is available for us to
Yeah.
see on the guidelines.
So they're in the
guidelines.
It's on every application form.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Yeah.
So the sweet spot is somewhere between the grant objectives and the criteria.
Yeah.
And more than occasionally, the panel might decide that the best way to decide very close applications is to invite the top 2 or 3 or whatever number in for a chat, like an interview. And so that can happen too. It doesn't always, but it can.
That's a good point. If it is and it is sometimes an apples and oranges sort of discussion where it's somebody's wanting to do something which is very you might have a very historical analysis project, and then somebody who's wanting to do a research component which then they're going to respond to in a form of poetry or something like that. So it's some of those things are best done, then we'll get that person in, and they have to give a 10-minute presentation about their project, which also then tests their ability to speak and present and communicate their project. So that happens occasionally, and then we also then do our due diligence with the proposed candidate. So we do checks on people and make sure that we tick all those boxes and that we're using public funds in an appropriate way as well. Any last questions, thoughts? Chrissy? You can't apply. Queensland State Library staff can't apply.
The closing date is Thursday the 28th of March.
Oh, my notes are incorrect.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I wrote 29th.
Yeah. 28th, Thursday. Oh, okay, so we decided to not put it on the Friday because often, that's hard. So yeah, sorry, Thursday, 28th of May. At 5 p.m. March.
At 5 p.m.
I'm glad you guys are all on top of it. Sorry. Just testing.
So it's really 2 weeks from now.
And the details are the phone number and the details are online if you have any further questions about the application. 3 weeks. What was today? 7?
3 weeks.
Yeah, literally 3 weeks. Yeah.
Do you have a criteria in selecting a referee? I could get my best friend to say I'm a great person, but that's not really what you're looking for.
I think the best referees in these circumstances are to choose people who are familiar with your work and your ability in the context of what you're applying for. For instance, if you were applying to look at how victims of motor accidents in 1931 were treated, and you'd done some previous work on accidents and injuries for a medical project or a statistical project, choose someone from that field. Then, if your project involves analytic research, as Gavin mentioned, someone who's been familiar with your work in that capacity. So it's a real case of horses for courses, but it does need to be someone who is familiar with you and your work. And most people who are familiar with people and their work are familiar with the person and the qualities of the person. So someone who's familiar with you in your work context or your previous experience context in the area in which you're applying will know you as a person and will know that yes, you could do the job and yes, you're a good bloke. So that's the best way to choose them. Horses for courses.
If you're applying as a duo, would you have 3 references or referees or 6?
You can't cross-reference. So
6 referees?
yeah, I would. I think 2 for the group would be not team would be fine. So I think 2 would suffice. Oh, sorry, 3. Sorry, yeah, 3 would suffice. Not per application.
And in fact, if it is a duo and 3 people can speak about each of those people, that then means that duo probably is a good operating team, because that's one of the difficulties about joint applications and joint researches. You need to be able to work well together. And so if 3 referees know you in that context, that should be fine.
I just had just with the placemaking fellowship, because it has a specific location, are there any other specific conditions to that fellowship?
Specific to that one, there's the general one, so of like 12 months, all those sorts of things. The specificity of the topic and the place, that's pretty much it. There's that's the main one. The stipend is it's $10,000 is the stipend for that. So it's say slightly different to the Oxley Fellowship, but that's the directedness of the subject matter is probably the main difference. And it's a different topic, but we have done that. We have the Letty Katz Award, which is a fellowship we run every 2 years, and it's not on this year, on Queensland music in Queensland. So, in some ways, sometimes we have been fairly directed in topics, but yeah, this is the most focused one we've done. Yeah.
What's prompted that? Just
The timeliness, and I think there's a lot of stories that are coming up with people who've used to work in the old Peters factory, and the heritage assessment there's been a heritage report done of the building, and it's not quite the full story. Is what we're finding. Yeah.
What was the time frame on assessing the applications when we were expecting us to be advised?
So we will, the big song and dance to announce the successful applicants is the 31st of May. We're having our Queensland Memory Awards. Sorry? 29th. Sorry. Isn't it 30? Oh no, sorry. Sorry, we're doing a series of events which are attached to it, which are on the 29th of May, sorry. And that is, you would obviously be notified. It's not like the Oscars where you don't know. Yeah, so it's about 3 weeks before, so you would probably find out kind of early kind of May, and then unsuccessful candidates would obviously be notified after that. And yeah.
When is someone up and running? What's the time frame?
So what we generally do is the clock starts ticking on the 12 months once you sign your agreement. So generally what will happen is it's a little bit often we do it in Queensland Week, the Queensland Memory Awards notification. We pushed it a bit earlier this year. So that's publicly announced, but often people will start kind of a month to 6 weeks after that date, once the agreement's signed and the orientation and the induction happens. So most people, it sort of runs from July, August, 19 to July, August 2020. So yeah, it's not run on the calendar year or anything like that. Which makes a real headache for our finance people, but that's fine. Yeah.
Just a question about the referee reports. Are they to be attached to the application, or are they people to be contacted at a later time?
People to be contacted, yes.
So yeah, the report only needs to be provided. Yeah, it's just the details. Yeah. Okay. Well, the traffic looks like it's better outside.
Yeah.
So thanks for coming. We really appreciate it, and yeah, good luck for your research. All the best, and we'll hope to see you soon. Thank you, and thanks to the panel.